Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. After jointly inaugurating work on India's first bullet train, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Japanese counterpart Shinzo Abe held summit talks today and signed 15 agreements to enhance strategic partnership, agreeing to strengthen cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, where China is increasingly assertive. A joint statement said India and Japan also agreed to strengthen cooperation against terror groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS and Pakistan-based Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba, calling upon Islamabad to act against those behind the 2008 Mumbai terror attack and Pathankot. It was the fourth annual summit between the two leaders. On this edition of The Big Picture, we'll take stock of the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to India. Joining me on the program today are Shrabani Roy Chowdhury, Professor Japanese Studies, JNU, Bharat Karnad, Research Professor, National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research, Pinak Ranjan Chakravarty, Distinguished Fellow, Observer Research Foundation and former Secretary, MEA. TK Arun, Editor, Opinion, The Economic Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to start with the lady on the program. What are the key takeaways from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to India? I think the major takeaway in this particular visit of his has been our defense sector, equipments, etc. Definitely the Asia-Africa growth corridor would be something that we would look forward to in future also, in the way and it will progress. On the lighter note, of course, the takeaways are the fact that we are looking towards a food culture exchange between both the countries. We are also looking at research, joint research, as well as language being taken forward to the people, which would essentially ensure that we have a more people-to-people exchange. And I think that is what really augurs well when a bilateral relationship to take beyond the official circle. Indeed. TK Arun, as far as the economic takeaways are concerned, what were they?
See, I wouldn't think that the economic takeaway is the big thing. Main thing is strategic. You just imagine the Chinese analysts. What are they looking at when they look at the summit in India? Are they looking at some economic agreements between the two countries? Or are they looking at the Malabar exercise in which India, the US and Japan take part? Are they looking at the closer defense cooperation between these countries? Are they looking at the emergence of a viable counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific region? I think that is the real takeaway. I mean, the economic stuff is neither here nor there. The Japanese companies need markets for their sophisticated engineering equipment, and a bullet train and various other kind of infrastructure facilities in India would provide them a market. But they might as well find this market elsewhere. That's not the main thing. India is salient because it provides a natural counterbalance to China in the region without raising an overtly hostile or aggressive posture. This is the advantage. Sure. Bharat Karnad, would you agree with that? Chinese hegemony in the region has brought Japan and India closer together?
Well, of course, that's the natural motivation for both the countries to get together. But I think there is a certain lack of urgency, if I may put it that way, in dealing with the Chinese menace that both the countries espy. For instance, in the 2015 meeting, the summit between Abe and Modi, the joint statement then talked about synergy between India's Act East policy and Japan's infrastructure partnership policy. It's taken nearly 2 years for there to be a certain merging, with the bullet train going forward, the foundation stone being laid and so on. So there needs to be a lot more urgency, I think. And the lack of urgency, if I get it right from the Japanese sources, is basically on India's part. Everything in Indian government works very slowly. And that, I think, is always invariably to the detriment of the national interest, India's national interest. The Japanese are far, shall we say, they have a certain sense that we need to progress very fast, things have to be fast forwarded, and to get on with things. But that doesn't seem to quite gel with the Indian way of doing things, which is far more deliberate and therefore takes time. This needs to be changed, I think, at the India end, and hopefully the fact that Modi and Abe summit will progress this aspect of it.
Sure. You know, Ambassador, do you think that alarm bells have sounded in China after Prime Minister Abe's visit to India? They've said quite a few things together, both Prime Minister Modi and Abe, as far as China is concerned.
Well, if you go by their media reaction, they seem sanguine. The comments coming out simply say that, oh, we are okay with all these things and things like that. Nobody can actually challenge China. You know the kind of self-confident kind of utterances that you would normally expect out of a controlled media like we have in China. But it does irritate them, I think, to some extent. And there is a strategic sort of a shadow over this relationship. Not just India and Japan, but I think India, Japan, USA. When the three have taken together, then I think China has some cause to worry, in the sense that whether this is developing into some kind of a containment kind of a strategy, because they have seen, we have seen during the Cold War how the containment of Soviet Union worked, and it ultimately led to the demise of the Soviet Union. But let's also not forget, when you look at the economics of it, China is a far larger economic partner of India than Japan is. Look at the trade figures. Look at, I don't know the investments, but I don't think Japanese investments in India have exceeded 5 billion or so in last year. I don't know how much is China's investment, but India's economic and particularly trade relationship with China overshadows any other country's trade relationship. So let us not forget that this is a factor. It's going to remain a factor. And I would also like to say that Japan is, apart from what Professor Karnad said about Indian way of doing things, which puts off, of course, a lot of investors, etc. But the fact is that India is an attractive market, in the big market, etc., growing market, so people will come. I'm not saying that we should not try and improve our ways of functioning, but let me come back to the point I was trying to make. That is, Japan is still, in my view, a hesitant partner.
Okay,
Because
still a hesitant partner, you say. Okay.
Because there are some reasons for it. One, of course, their own trade with China and their huge investments there. Secondly, they have certain self-imposed constraints on their own, sort of through their own wartime, post-war constitution, like the nuclear, even the defense area, they were not supposed to join or export and all these things. They're trying, I think Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Abe is trying to break out of those things. And the compulsions and the compelling sort of reason is clearly China.
Sure, sure. You know, Professor, as far as the agreements are concerned, as far as the Chinese are concerned, you know, Japanese was in fact the only country that supported India openly as far as the Doklam standoff was concerned. And, you know, and everyone's been talking about this strategic partnership between India and Japan. Can they really take it to the next level?
I think India-Japan strategic relationship will be definitely monitored, if might be a very strong word, but monitored by the US, approach towards the Indo-Pacific region. I personally feel that India-Japan relationship at the moment definitely is going to take off with respect to the South China and East China Sea. South China more so because you have the country, Indonesia and Vietnam, which these have very good relationship with India, and therefore, and India has a presence out there even economically. So probably Japanese take on the strategic matter would be to try to use Indian goodwill in finding a space for themselves in this region. Indo-Pacific, obviously, you have the Malabar exercises, which is something that's talked about. But let's not forget that Abe had also talked about a diamond in which they had included Australia. That is one thing that seems to be in the background, but not surfacing in any of these agreement or meetings, summit meetings. But I think there would be some kind of a take, because Japan and Australia themselves have gone ahead and done certain exercises of agreements which are moving Australia into the realm of Japan. So I think this diamond that Japan has, Abe has talked about in the just after he won his election, might find some kind of a presence in future.
Okay. Professor Karnad, is that what's happening? The ambassador also mentioned it, that, alone India, Japan and the United States might find it difficult to take on someone like a China. But then, is that what's happening? Kind of a bloc that is forming, that is trying to keep China at bay?
Look, the security diamond again is a natural coalition of states on the Chinese periphery. Japan in the Far East, India on the other flank, and this is the way to go, actually. But the point again is that there is a hesitation perhaps on the part of Tokyo, as the ambassador mentioned, but there's also, I think, a great deal of hesitation in on the Indian government's part in articulating its own role in asserting itself in Asia generally, and in the Indian Ocean in particular, and certainly in the seas of China. Now, if New Delhi believes that it is part of the freedom of navigation movement, for instance, in the South China Sea, then there's no reason for the Indian Navy not to assert that aspect of it, and to keep plying through the South China Sea without reference to China's, whatever statements they make by way of asserting supremacy or primacy in that area, suggesting that that's very much part of the Chinese maritime domain, and exclusively Chinese maritime domain, which would mean and imply that they have control of it. It is Chinese territory, and any foreign state comes into it at their sufferance. Now, that's precisely the notion that India has to combat. India has to say, well, we don't believe in this, we will not accept it, and here it is. We are going to get our convoys and our battle fleets through to wherever we want to go in the South China Sea, irrespective of the Chinese claim by way of a 9-dash line or whatever it is they claim as their territory. This is the attitude we need to have. Unfortunately, Delhi's attitude has always been passive, defensive.
But is that changing? Is that changing?
No, it's not fast enough.
Look,
if there is any, Doklam is just a border skirmish. Let's not try to blow it up into something that never was. It's just a border skirmish of a whole series of border skirmishes that India and China have been having since '62. It's not anything new. It's just that this was on Bhutanese territory. It's the difference. But we have always had these kinds of skirmishes on the LAC. So my point to make is that if India means to be a major player in Asia, then it has to discard its reluctance to act a big power and to, in a sense, force our interests and act as per our interests and force the issue in many ways. For instance, you're talking about containing China. Well, yes, that's the end game. Why is US absolutely necessary to it? It is not. Now that Japan is being pushed towards nuclear weapons itself, with India on the other side in the two flanks with two nuclear powers, you would be better able to contain China than have an interloping United States, for instance, which is not going to act against its own interest, and it doesn't give a damn whether North Korea blows up, North Korea blows up Tokyo or not, or whether it bombs Delhi. So therefore, we have to have a security structure that I've always argued that it should be organic to Asia.
Sure.
Involving just Asian states, because we have the most interests in it. And
right.
America or an extraterritorial power will never have it, that kind of interest. Of course, they'd like to be there. They're supposed to be a global power, and therefore they'll have a navy, the 7th Fleet in Yokosuka in Tokyo and elsewhere. But that doesn't mean a commitment to engage should things get hot.
Sure. Your point well taken. Let's move on now and come back to, to some of the takeaways. And one aspect that was highlighted by the media over the last 2 days, TK Arun, was the fact that the foundation for the bullet train project has finally been laid. What can we expect from it? How is it going to change things?
Bullet trains sound very good. They are exciting, but along certain stretches between two cities which are close enough for a fast train to compete with an airline, compete with the time that is taken to travel to an airport which is most places a little distance away from the main downtown, and the time taken to check in, the time taken to check out. If you take all that, the time taken for air travel, when that is comparable with the time taken for city heart to city heart bullet train travel, if it is comparable, bullet trains are viable. Beyond that, they are fancy, showpieces, which a country like India really cannot afford. But so the ideal thing to do would have been to say, let there be an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, which will run bullet trains, and if they are commercially viable, whoever wants to invest can invest in it. The Japanese think it's viable, let them invest in it. Why should the Indian Railways and Indian government spend 1 rupee in a bullet train project when it cannot actually protect its own regular passenger trains, ensure its safety through regular track renewal and maintenance? That should be our primary responsibility. Actually, we are not putting in much money, but we are still putting in some money into this. That could have been avoided.
Yeah. So will that model be applied somewhere else, in other projects as well, where we are putting in little money, the Japanese are putting in about 80 to 85% of the money, and we are going to repay that as a loan with an interest of just 0.1% over a 50-year period. Is that model going to be applied somewhere else as well?
They might. See, interest rates in Japan are very, very low. So, for us, when we are used to borrowing from the bank at 10, 11, 12% rates, we might see this as an extremely concessional cheap rate. For Japan, which actually ran a negative policy rate of interest till recently, 0.1 is okay, cheap, but not all that cheap. For them, it's a fairly commercially viable kind of rate of interest, especially given the market it is giving to its vital engineering companies. So that's fine. Can I just add a nuance to the China, India, Japan thing? The current world order, and especially the one in Asia Pacific, was made after the Second World War by the victors. There is nothing in the nature of a natural law about this current order, which is dominated by the US. As China rises, as India rises, and Asian countries become more powerful, it's only natural that the US umbrella be done away with, and the countries of the region assume the responsibility of their own security. And in this, the US will have to make way for China, for Japan, for India, and for other ASEAN countries. Now, how this is done is the real issue. Will it be done by making China an aggressive bully which can throw its weight around, or will it be done in a more orderly fashion where all countries of the region will have a greater say? It is in this, by creating a natural counterweight to China, that the combination of India and Japan will force China to be more responsible, less aggressive, and more accommodative of other people's interests.
Sure.
I think this is the real goal that we are seeking to achieve, not to maintain the existing order which is led by the US.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about some of the other aspects as far as Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to India are concerned. Ambassador, terror topping the agenda yet again. This is not the first time that terror has topped the agenda as far as bilateral talks between India and another nation are concerned. This time too, terror topping the agenda.
Well, I think that is a Japanese sort of giveaway to India, because Japan is really has not been hit by this kind of terror.
Has not been victimized.
Has not been the terror that we face in India from Pakistan particularly, and the origins of that kind of terror. I don't think Japan has faced that, but Japan does recognize. I think the whole world now recognizes, to some extent, I suppose, that that terror is a problem, and there are certain areas where terror is incubated, particularly in our neighborhood in Pakistan, and that a state uses terror for its strategic objectives that Pakistan has tended to do, at least on the west, on its eastern front and our western front. So I think that terror is a what shall I say? It's a given thing today that everybody condemns terror. So it's very easy now for countries to accept references in a joint statement to terror, because it's the done thing. I mean, it's the global norm, if you could say, to include these words. It was included even in BRICS statement. So that is how I would look at the terror aspect. But I don't think that, I mean, there may be some intelligence cooperation between Japan and India, but that's really not of much, it doesn't have too much of sort of, shall we say, traction as far as India's problems are concerned. But it is a symbolic, kind of a thing, and particularly the fact that it calls upon the speedy trial, etc., of those who did the Bombay sort of
2611 Pathankot.
Yeah, exactly. So that way, it's a message also to Pakistan that that everybody is concerned about this and that you clean up your house.
Sure. Shabani Rai Chaudhary, is there any aspect that we missed out as far as this visit is concerned?
That's an interesting question.
Areas of cooperation that you think that should have been put forward.
I haven't read the joint statement. I don't think it's still out and clear. Nuclear agreement which was done, I don't know whether there has been a follow-up on it. That's something that never made any news till at least when we sat down out here today. I was expecting something more on that aspect. And I was also expecting certain amount of, make in India is fine, but I was expecting more investment commitment towards make in India effort as well as skill development. Though there is this in the bullet train agreement, there is the skill development institute that is being opened up and money being given by Japan on that. But I was expecting a little more, kind of more of a roadmap towards the whole thing, which probably once we get the joint statement, we might find it in that.
Sure. Bharat, Karnad, as far as areas of cooperation are concerned, defense cooperation is one aspect where India and China can do extremely well. Do you believe that the Japanese are really going to open the doors for India as far as defense technology is concerned?
Well, again, they had a certain thing on the table. They have had it for the last several years. This is the US-2 flying boat, which is particularly of great use to India with huge sea territories in the Andaman, Nicobar, Lakshadweep and so on. These flying boats are perhaps the best in the world, the Shinmaiwa US-2s. And the Japanese have offered it. They offered credit to set up factories. They have offered just about everything, and yet we are the one, that's what I mean by hesitation. We have done nothing. We are flying the same old Dorniers, the German Dornier aircraft for maritime surveillance and so on, which makes no sense whatsoever. When you have these extraordinarily good boats, effective, efficient, both in terms of running costs and everything else, and they are especially good for anti-terror operations in the islets, like the operation we mounted, Operation Cactus in the Maldives. These are the kinds of boats, because you can put in Special Forces unit, a small company, fly the thing off, and next moment you're in Maldives, quite literally. You see, it's a sort of thing that we don't seem to, get our minds around. We have no strategic notions at all. Our military aspects are so mundane and trivial in some sense. Pakistan. You lose sight of the rest of the world. And this is costing us. This is costing us in the neighborhood in trying to become what we say we want to become, a security provider for the region. And we do nothing to actualize it. And this show goes on. Next time Abe comes in, we'll still have the Shinmaiwa up hanging there, hanging fire. They have done everything short of giving it to you on a platter. Now, we have to show some interest and get going. One other thing, on the Shinkansen technology, is not entirely irrelevant to our railway technology, prevailing technology levels, which are very, very low. We have improved our rolling stock, for instance, with the vestibular telescopic technologies we got from Germany.
Right.
And the new coaches you see. What the bullet train, the Shinkansen bullet train technology will do is improve your tracks, signaling, and whole bit of track communications ongoing, which will upgrade the technology levels of the rest of the railways. That's how you have to see it, as a catalyst for modernizing the rest of our railways. So while the cost of the bullet train itself may look enormous. In real terms, there are these spillover benefits that we have to have in mind.
Right, right. I've got about 1 minute left on the program, so quick closing comments from both my other guests as well. TK Arun, you know, Shinzo Abe spoke about how India has the manpower and the Japanese have the technology. Will we see the coming together of both these?
I don't know if Japan actually has the technology that India needs. For our cyber defense, for example, who has the technology? Who is a reliable supplier of technology that India can rely on 100%? Nobody. There are certain kinds of technology we have to develop ourselves, and nobody can supply that. Mainstream engineering technology of bullet trains and say carbon fiber and etc. These perhaps they can supply us. They are available from other sources also. Manpower, yes, India has the manpower. The largest supply of young people who can go to university and be trained in new skills are there in India.
Sure.
So that's true.
Okay. And Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks on where do India and Japan go from here?
I think technology is an important area, and India and Japan are going to collaborate more closely. And if this kind of a situation in Asia that we have discussed develops, and it need not be in conflict with any other nation, preferably.
Sure.
But in cooperation with even China, it can develop. But the question is, as we know, that if whether China is willing for a more cooperative architecture, security architecture in Asia, is still the moot point. And people are not convinced that China is still willing. Okay. And that is why you see these kind of counterbalancing moves that are taking.
All right. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Sarbani Rao Chowdhury, Bharat, Karnad, Pinak, Ranjan, Chakravarty and TK Arun, thank you so much for joining us on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. See you again next time.